Speakers, this is our first speaker of this year. I hope you come back for more, people come in more. Wherever you want. No reserves. I know it's the first one, so we're going to have probably not many people, sometimes people. I do thank everybody for showing up. I'm Bill Medwidge, I'm the president of the museum, and I welcome you all here. Bob Lytle is going to give a little presentation on the person here.
Well, thank you, Bill. Welcome, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing Mark Dunkelman today. I've known Mark for probably over 10 years now. Mark is president of the Rhode Island Civil War Roundtable, among other things. But he's a lifelong historian interested in the Civil War, and in particular, his great-grandfather's regiment, the 154th New York Volunteer Infantry. As a result of his interest in his great-grandfather, he has taken on the task of being the spokesman for the 154th. He organizes their reunions, has set up a monument. They're from the Chautauqua area of New York State. He's interviewed over 1,300 descendants of the 154th Volunteers. He's probably gone through, I think in his bio it says 1,700 letters. He is an expert on the 154th Volunteer Regiment. As among other things, he is an artist, and he has done a mural in Gettysburg, Foster Avenue here in Gettysburg. And that mural ties into this presentation today. The story of Amos Humiston, Gettysburg's unknown soldier. One of Mark's 6 books that he has written. And this story is going to be told to you this afternoon, and it's quite interesting. And with that, help me welcome Mark Dunkelman to the podium.
Okay. We have the mouse. The mouse, you put it on the table. I'll sit out this way. Thank you.
Go for it.
Thank you, Bob. And thanks for coming out today. How many of you have heard the story of Sergeant Amos Humiston and his family? Oh, good. You haven't heard. So I can share it with you. Gettysburg's Unknown Soldier, The Life, Death, and Celebrity of Amos Humiston is the title of my second book, which came out in hardcover in 1999 and came out more recently in paperback from Gettysburg Publishing. And I'm sorry to say that I have not a single copy of the book with me to offer for sale. But it's widely available at all your favorite book buying sites on the internet. So, I'm going to tell not only the story of Sergeant Humiston, but a little about the backstory of how I came to write this book. This is a picture of myself on the left in my much younger days, and a good friend of mine, Christopher Lee Ford, on the right. We're on the Gettysburg battlefield. I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York. And Chris was a neighbor of mine, and we discovered as school students that we shared an interest in the American Civil War. We had differing perspectives. I'm a descendant of a Union soldier. Chris was a descendant of a Confederate soldier. So our discussions sometimes clashed. But at one point, Chris lent me a book called Gettysburg, What They Did Here by Luther W. Minig, and it was a very popular guidebook to the battlefield of Gettysburg that was published back in the 20s and kept in print over and over and over through the decades. And I believe this copy came out somewhere around 1954 or thereabouts. And in the book, there's a section towards the back with human interest stories. And one of those stories is the Humiston children. And here's the way they told the story. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the corpse of a Union soldier was found on the battlefield, There was nothing on his person to identify him, except in his hand he held a photograph of his 3 children. On the left is Frank, he's the oldest. In the middle is Fred, the youngest. And to the right is their sister Alice. A Philadelphia doctor named John Francis Bournes came to Gettysburg after the battle to tend to the thousands of wounded left in the aftermath of the fighting. And Dr. Bournes heard this story, saw the photograph, and recognized that this photograph was the single sad clue to the identity of the soldier and his family. So he borrowed the photograph and he took it back with him to Philadelphia, where he had his practice and home. And he instigated publicity about this in the newspapers. And this is an article from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Whose father was he? And these stories spread from newspaper to newspaper throughout the North. Now, back then, they couldn't publish photographs, right? So in this article, they have a very minute description of the photograph. How the children are posed, their approximate ages, the fact that the boy and the girl were wearing material, clothing cut from the same material. The dead soldier and the daguerreotype is the headline in this article, which appeared in a religious paper called the American Presbyterian, which was published in Philadelphia. It wasn't a daguerreotype, which is the earliest form of photography. It was an ambrotype, which was a later type of photography where the imagery was put on glass. So these stories swept throughout the country, and it's incredible, but within a month after these stories arrive, being published, Dr. Bournes received a letter from someone in Portville, New York, that a woman had read the description of this photo, and it seemed to be very much like a photograph she had sent to her husband before the Battle of Gettysburg, and she hadn't heard from him since the Battle of Gettysburg. And that woman turned out to be Mrs. Philinda Humiston, the mother of Frank, Alice, and Fred. And when she was sent a carte de visite, in other words, a small paper photographic copy of this image, and took a look at it, she knew that she was a widow and her 3 children were orphans. And so a second great wave of publicity swept the country. The dead soldier identified. Here is Philinda Humiston in her earliest known photographic portrait, and there are only 3 of them known to exist at this point. And here's the children again in a carte de visite. So this is a small, about yay big, yay tall, paper photograph mounted on a thin sheet of cardboard. This is after the kids had been identified, obviously, because their names are at the bottom, and there's a whole script behind. Now, this story had touched so many people throughout the North that there was a tremendous wave of interest in it, and it inspired songs and poetry. This one is called The Unknown Soldier, Who Is He? This was still before the identification. And that was eventually set to music and published as a song. An even more popular one was called The Children of the Battlefield, which was the result of a contest that was held by the American Presbyterian, that religious paper that had led to the identification of Sergeant Humiston. It turned out that James G. Clark, who wrote this song, was somewhat of a ringer because he was a professional musician. He toured the country singing his own compositions, ballads, etc. This song sold so well that they eventually changed and made it even nicer cover to it with a better lithograph of the 3 kids. And so this is how I told the story in my first book, which was published in 1981, The Hardtack Regiment, because that's about all I knew about Sergeant Humiston at that point. And this image called The Last Thought of a Dying Father, appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which was one of two, together with Harper's Weekly, these two illustrated newspapers that came out on a weekly basis and were full of engravings. Now, this is an entirely fictitious artist's imagination of Sergeant Humiston on the Gettysburg battlefield, clutching that photograph of his 3 children. The very short article that accompanied it didn't even mention Sergeant Humiston by name. So this story has been told many, many times since the American Civil War, before I wrote my book. Many times. But in all of the in guidebooks and books about Gettysburg, but in all the tellings, Sergeant Humiston is a corpse on the battlefield. He's the dead soldier holding this picture of his 3 children. And I knew that there was a book there, but to get a book out of this story, I had to find out a lot more about not only the incident itself, the family, but Sergeant Humiston himself. And I figured the way to do that would be to connect with his descendants. He had 3 children. Presumably they had children as well. And the place to start was in Portville, Cattaraugus County, New York. Bob mentioned that I studied the 154th New York. That was Amos Humiston's regiment, and it was largely raised in Cattaraugus County. And lucky me, well, that's my first book. I meant to show you that before. I did the drawing for the cover. I'm going backwards. Sorry. Here's Portville, New York, earliest known photograph. It's a little town on the Allegheny River, right next door to Olean, New York, which you might have heard of if you ever do crossword puzzles. Olean is a very frequent clue in crosswords. In any case, this is a rural county, and this is where Amos was living at the time he enlisted. So I figured, let's check things in Portville. And I happen to have 2 good friends on the Portville Preservation and Historical Society. That's Kay Anderson on the left and Rhonda Pollock on the right, both very active with the Portville Historical and Preservation Society. So I got in touch with my friends there, and they told me that they had managed to link up with a descendant of Frank, the oldest child, Frank Humiston. And his name was David Humiston Kelly. And he lived in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. He was on the faculty of the university there. He's an archaeologist. He's one of the most brilliant men I ever met. He helped decipher the Mayan hieroglyphics. He was an expert on calendric systems. He was an avid genealogist who had traced one branch of his family back to King David in the Bible. David was quite the guy. So I started a correspondence with him and wound up out at his home. And here's David sitting barefoot, which he always liked. He liked to pat around in his bare feet. And these are all letters and other documents relating to the Humiston family. And I spent a week out there going through all this material. Photographs, letters, diaries, and it was wonderful because here is the story of the family after this incident that made them so well known in Civil War America, the story of their later lives. And I figured readers would really be interested in what happened to Phalinda, the mother, and the 3 children. And the material that Dave Kelly had really solved that problem for me. Dave also had this, the only known portrait from life of Amos Humiston. And this is an ambrotype photograph as well. Ambrotype, again, an image on glass. His only portrait from life. So the latter portrait of him as a soldier, they just took this picture and they retouched it to put a beard and a uniform on him. This is the only time he was ever photographed. This is another item that David had, a tinted photograph of the 3 children by one of the Philadelphia photographers. A lot of the story evolved out of Philadelphia because that's where Dr. Bournes was living. So among the material Dave Kelly had was pictures of the children as they grew up. Here's Frank, the eldest. Frank eventually got an education, Dartmouth, University of Pennsylvania Medical School, became a doctor up in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Here's Alice as a teenage girl, and Fred. And here is Frank again with his family up in Jaffrey. He was beloved in the town, had a large family. Here's Fred. Fred became a traveling salesman out of the Boston area and married and eventually had 2 children. He's pictured with his eldest daughter here. And here's Alice. Alice never married, and she held a variety of different jobs for a while. She actually lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and was with, of all things, the orphanage there, the state orphanage. But here she is in Massachusetts, Leominster, Mass. Yeah, she had a farm up there, chicken farm, for a while. Like I said, she was kind of nomadic. She wound up living in California in her later years, and here she is in her later years. Probably out there in California, Glendale, LA area. And here's Philinda with one of her granddaughters. This is at the house up in Jaffrey. So with this material I had from Dave Kelly, I was really excited to get it because, as I said, it really told me about the family's later life. But what amazed me was how little there was in this massive body of material about this incident that made the family so well known. The tragedy of losing their husband and father, Amos. And the best way to illustrate this is, at one point, a lecturer came to Jaffrey, New Hampshire, to give a talk on the Battle of Gettysburg. And he was showing magic lantern slides, which is much like I'm showing you these slides today, PowerPoint slides. And all of a sudden, a picture of the Humiston children came up on the screen, and the people of Jaffrey, New Hampshire said, "Oh, that's Frank. That's Frank and Fred, and they've been living here for years." They never had made the connection. And to me, this is rather sad. Frank, his wife, Carrie, Fred, his wife, and Philinda are all buried up in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. But poor Alice, who wound up out on the West Coast and died during the Great Depression, is buried all by herself out there in California, which is kind of sad. So I'm still searching for Amos Humiston and his voice at this point. I know I'm getting a lot closer to being able to write a book. Well, I was introduced to a fellow named Gardner H. Shattuck Jr. He goes by Tuck Shattuck. And he had written this book, A Shield and a Hiding Place, The Religious Life of the Civil War Armies. And I met Tuck through mutual friends at a dinner party. And we started talking Civil War history. At the end of the night, Tuck said to me, "What are you working on now, Mark?" And I said, "I'm working on the Humiston story." And he knew instantly what I was talking about. And he told me that Fred Humiston's daughter, Eleanor, used to be the secretary at a parish that Tuck was at up in Massachusetts. He's an Episcopal minister. Now, this was a branch of the family that Dave Kelly, the avid genealogist, was aware of, but had lost track of somehow. And so this is in the days before the internet or cell phones. I called information. Remember when you used to have to do that? And I got the number of a Mrs. John Cox in Medford, Massachusetts. And I called up, and a male voice answered the phone. And he said, it was this guy, Alan Lawrence Cox. I introduced myself. I explained what I was looking for, what I was doing. And he said, well, you're lucky you caught me. My mom's in a nursing home. I only come here to the house once in a great while, just to check on things. And then he said, I've got Amos's wartime letters. Come on up and see them. Well, it didn't take me long to get up Route 95 up to Massachusetts and meet with Alan Lawrence Cox and take a look at these letters, Amos Humiston Civil War letters. And one of the first ones that I happened to look at was this one written on May 9th, 1863. This is a week to the day after Amos Humiston was in the Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia, where, as he informed his wife in this very letter, he was hit by a spent ball in the chest, which luckily, if not for an accident of velocity and direction, he might have died at the Chancellorsville battlefield and been buried in a mass grave along with the other Union casualties of that battle because the Confederates took the battlefield. But he survived. And in this letter, on the second page, and it's going to be difficult perhaps for you to make this out, but on this page, he wrote this: I got the likeness of the children, and it pleased me more than anything that you could have sent me. How I want to see them and their mother is more than I can tell. I hope that we may all live to see each other again if this war does not last too long. So here he is acknowledging the receipt of this soon-to-be famous throughout the North photograph, little knowing how important it was going to be to him and his family. With his letters was a poem Amos read called To My Wife, and he described it as some of the crazy productions of my brain in the shape of poetry. And it's a very touching poem. You've put the children to bed, dear wife, and covered them over with care, my Frankie, Allie, and Fred, and they've said their evening prayer. And he goes on to describe how he's doing picket duty all by himself, thinking of home, while the family's thinking of him. And he ends with the hope that the war will end and we get to reunite again with his family. Which, of course, as we know, didn't happen. Here's a painting I did of my imagination of Amos on the battlefield with the picture in his hand. So I became friends with Dave Kelly here in the center with his daughter Megan and Alan Cox. And here we are visiting the Humiston house in Jaffrey, which was where Dr. Frank Humiston had his practice, etc. And we were all together again a little while later that summer. This is the summer of 1993 in Gettysburg for the unveiling of the Amos Humiston Monument. And I was honored to give the main address at the dedication, during which I quoted from Amos's letters for the first time in public. And here's the group at the Homestead Lodging for Tourists on Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, which will also figure into our story. So now I've got Amos's voice in his Civil War letters. And I know how his time in the service went, when he got sick, how his comrades cared for him, etc., etc. Then another amazing thing happened, and that brings us right to New Bedford, Massachusetts. In one of the stories that circulated after Amos was identified, mention was made that he had made a whaling voyage to the South Pacific. Well, I happen to have a neighbor up in Providence named Virginia Adams, who used to be the librarian at the Whaling Museum here in New Bedford. And so I called Virginia and I asked her, how can I find out if a guy named Amos Humiston ever made a whaling voyage out of New Bedford? She said, I'll get back to you. A few days later, she did. She said, yeah, he sailed out of New Bedford in December of 1850 aboard the ship Harrison and was gone until April of 1854, and the logbook of the voyage is in the Providence Public Library, my backyard. And so I really got into examining Amos's adventure aboard the whale ship Harrison. Here's his certification. Here's the logbook. I went through the logbook, took copious notes. I wrote 3 chapters on the whaling voyage. I got really into studying whaling, and fortunately for me, the whaling industry is one of the best documented early American industries, and that documentation is here in New Bedford. Up at the time, the Kendall Whaling Museum was in Sharon. The New Bedford Free Public Library was a tremendous resource for me. So I drew maps in the book of the whaling voyage. And they were gone for almost 4 years. And things were kind of slow until they wound up in the Sea of Okhotsk. And there were plenty of bowhead whales up there, and they finally filled their ship and came back to New Bedford with a full ship full of oil, and they had already transshipped some of the bone, as they called the baleen at that point. And so this was quite an adventure for Amos Humiston. He got to, for example, this place, Lahaina on Maui in the so-called Sandwich Islands. Lahaina, of course, is the town that got burned down a year or 2 ago with the terrible wildfire out there. He also went to Hilo on the main island. So he had been around by the time he went into the service. But as with many of green hands, as they were called, making their first whaling voyage, one was enough for Amos Humiston. And he reverted to the occupation he had pursued before the war, harness making. Now, I wanted to tell something about harness making as well. That was his daily life. And my usual mode of research is to look in books, but I couldn't find much, if anything worthwhile, on harness making. And finally, one day, I just picked up the yellow pages and turned, and lo and behold, harness makers, the LaSalle Harness Company on the Peep-Toed Road in North Scituate, Rhode Island. And it turns out that David LaSalle is one of the best harness makers on the East Coast. And he's still using a lot of equipment and tools that Amos Humiston would have used, 150 years earlier. And so I went out and I met with David, and he gave me a tutorial on harness making, and he let me borrow some old catalogs that had these wonderful illustrations of the various tools harness makers used. And so there we go. I had everything at this point, all the source material I figured I needed to write the book. And I did. Now, there's a coda to this entire story. This is the back of one of those carte de visites of the children of the battlefield. And it explains that these photographs of the children are being sold to benefit the Homestead Orphanage in Gettysburg. And the Homestead Orphanage was founded, inspired by the story of Sergeant Humiston and his devotion to his family. And Dr. John Francis Bournes, the Philadelphia physician, realized right from the start that this could be a more widely dispersed charitable effort than just to succor the Humiston family. His plan was for an orphanage for soldiers' children in Gettysburg. And so a drive was started, board was selected, money was raised, and the orphanage opened in a couple of years after the Civil War ended Here's a picture of the main building at that time, and you can see the children in their uniforms. And this is during a visit by President Grant, or actually at this time he was still General Grant. This was in June of 1867, before he was elected the following year as president. Now, the Humiston family, Philinda and her 3 children, moved here, and Philinda took a position on the staff. She was the wardrobe mistress. Here's a stereoscopic photograph showing the orphanage buildings. And here's another picture. Now there's 2 orphanage buildings. Eventually this one on the left was added as a dormitory, and there's children playing out in the yard. And so this tragedy that had befallen the Humiston family, it was the inspiration for this great good that arose out of the tragedy, in that the soldiers' the Homestead Orphanage was founded in Gettysburg. Here's the children in Gettysburg, the Humistons. They're getting a little older. Here they are again. And here's their last photograph taken in Gettysburg. Philinda Humiston was not pleased living at this orphanage. She accepted a proposal for marriage from a man that she really didn't even know that well. His name was Asa Barnes, and he took Philinda to his home in Shirley, Massachusetts. And the children were left behind for a while so they could complete their year at school, but eventually they wound up joining them as well. This is a Homestead Good Conduct card given to one of the orphans, Lizzie Hutchinson, who became involved in a rather sad story that wound up being the finish to the Homestead Orphanage, and that was this. Dr. John Francis Borens hired a matron named Rosa Carmichael. I don't have a photograph of Mrs. Carmichael to show to you, but rumors started to sweep Gettysburg that she was mistreating these orphans. And then on Memorial Day in 1876, I believe it was, Mrs. Carmichael refused to let the orphans take part in the Memorial Day ceremonies at the National Cemetery, which was really right next door to the orphanage. And this got the local veterans of the Grand Army of the Republic post in Gettysburg extremely angry, because this had been the tradition. The children decorated the graves of the soldiers with flowers. Well, that caused the GAR to look even closer into the goings-on at the orphanage, and they discovered some terrible stories. We saw this, still there, this good conduct card to Lizzie Hutchinson. Well, it turns out that Lizzie Hutchinson did something that wasn't acceptable to Mrs. Rosa Carmichael, so she was forced to wear boys' clothing for 2 months. Well, there were other punishments, like making children stand on top of a desk for very long periods of time, locking little boys in the outhouse. And worst of all was, she had created literally a dungeon in the basement where she shackled and chained children, miscreant kids. And when all this was revealed, she was charged with assault, actually, on one of the orphans. And it turned out that Dr. John Francis Borens, who had been overseeing the operation of this place, who was the one that really had this entire story started when he took the photograph back to Philadelphia and instigated the wave of publicity. He was the one that basically was the driving force behind establishing the orphanage. Well, in the end, it turned out he was a crook, too. He was embezzling funds meant for the children. And so he was charged. And so the orphanage, this great good that had come out of the tragedy of the Humiston story, wound up having its own tragic, unfortunate ending. So here's the original orphanage building when years later it became Cliff Arquette's Soldiers Museum. Anybody remember Cliff Arquette? Charlie Weaver? Yep, he bought the building and he was a wood carver and he liked to carve figurines and he had a number of dioramas with his figurines of Civil War scenes in there. And he also carved one of little Johnny the orphan boy who posed in a dungeon in the basement of the place, because that's the famous story that emerged out of this whole deal. Now, today, the building houses ghostly images of Gettysburg. If you've been to Gettysburg in the past 20 years, you know that the ghost tour industry is booming there. Every night in the town of Gettysburg, you're going to see lantern-carrying guides ushering people around through supposed haunted spots in Gettysburg. And now, as a matter of fact, this is a little out of date because I think they've moved ghostly images out of the former orphanage building across the street to the Gettysburg Tour Center. The same owner owns these places. And now they're concentrating more on their history. I want to go down there and check it out and make sure that's the case. Now, the second building, which I mentioned was a dormitory originally, now houses Civil War tales at the homestead. And tales is spelled Tails. Now, this is a business run by a pair of twin sisters, and their thing is dioramas, very detailed dioramas of Civil War battle scenes. But the figurines aren't human, they're cats. And so you've got Confederate cats fighting Yankee cats on the various battlefields of the Civil War. A lot of people don't know what to make of this. I've become friends with these two women because I think it's very important. When the place was a rooming house, it was starting to get a little run down, and they fixed up the building, and they're running a successful business out of there. I've asked them if they're ever going to do a tableau with a dead cat on the battlefield holding a picture of his 3 little kittens, and they tell me that they might. So we have to keep our eyes open for that. So, to sum up, here's Sergeant Humiston's headstone in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. And it's one of the more visited of the headstones. It's in the New York section of the cemetery, number 14, row B. And frequently you will see a flag or a picture of the children, something left there in memory of Sergeant Humiston. His other lasting legacy in Gettysburg is the monument, which was dedicated, as I mentioned, in 1993 on the 130th anniversary of the battle, and stands very near to the spot where he was found. This monument is the only monument out of thousands of monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield. This one is the only monument to an individual enlisted man on the battlefield. And so that's a summary of my book, Gettysburg's Unknown Soldier. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thank you. Yes?
When was he born, what year, and how was he an older man when he went into the army?
Okay, he was 33 when he died. He was born in 1830, April 26, 1830 in Owego, Tioga County, New York. So he grew up in Tioga County. I believe he apprenticed as a harness maker there. And then he went off on his whaling voyage. And he came back and he met Philinda. Now he came back in April. The Harrison returned to New Bedford on April 20th. It must have taken him the better part of a week to get back home, I would imagine. July 4th, that July 4th, he married Philinda Betsy Ensworth Smith. She was a widow in Candor, New York, which again is in Tioga County. So it was a little after that they moved west to Cattaraugus County. I've brought with me terms of endearment in his letters home. I'll just pick one at random here. He wrote this on January 2nd, 1863, dear Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now there is no use of trying to tell you how much I want to see you or how often I think of you. There is no use to talk about it. If I ever live to get home, you will not complain of being lonesome again or of sleeping cold. So I will lay as close to you as the bark to a tree. That is so. Do you not feel afraid to stay home alone at nights? Keep up good courage. This is like everything else. It must have an end. Now kiss the children for me. Tell them they must be good children. I've transcribed, as Bob said, more than 1,700 wartime letters written by members of the 154th New York, Amos's regiment. It's very rare for the soldiers of that day, the men of that day, to express their love for their families as freely as Amos Humiston did. He just did. A lot of times a soldier would, say your affectionate husband at the end of a letter, sign his full name. Amos was constantly writing about how much he missed his family and Philinda. The very last mention he made in his last letter home, he said, I would like to see you tonight and the little ones. They will forget that they have got a pa. But this thing cannot last a great while longer, it seems to me. I want you to write to me as often as you can and not wait for me. And be a good girl. Keep up your courage. So goodbye. Yours truly, A. Humiston. The last letter she got from Amos. It was a great thrill for me to know about this story from my early days of studying American Civil War history and having the great good fortune to be able to make these connections, which enabled me to tell the story in full. It was a magic time. So thanks for coming out.